Okay, we are live again, and it's 10 o'clock, and we're going to continue our discussion this morning with the Senate Transportation Committee. Next, we have Dr. Gregory Rollingall. Is that, I'm pronouncing that correctly or close to it?
Close enough. It's Rowan Gould.
Okay, thank you, and welcome to our committee this morning. And you are from the University of Vermont, is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, tell us a little about yourself and what your role is before us this morning.
Okay, well, thank you all for giving me this opportunity to come tell you a little bit about the TRC and what we're trying to do here and how we can hopefully help the state answer some of its transportation.
Oh, we like that. I think you can help the state is good. We need all the help we can get.
Yeah, right. Well, that's our job here. So I have some slides, and I'll say what a professor usually says. I'll save some time. I'll try to go through them quickly and have plenty of time for conversation.
Okay.
And we'll see if I actually accomplish that. So about myself, I moved to Vermont about 2 years ago from New Mexico, where I was a professor for about 6 or 7 years at the University of New Mexico.
That was a good choice to come here, see?
Yeah, I'm from, originally from Massachusetts, spent most of my childhood in New Hampshire, went to school in Maine, or college in Maine, before going out to California to finish some more college. But it's been my long-term goal to come back to the Northeast of New England, which is, it's where my family is. It's also part of the country I love. And I think there are, the thing that really drives my interest in transportation research is growing up around here and thinking about, smaller towns and places I've lived in New Hampshire, Maine, and visit, and how can we make living in smaller and rural communities something that's sustainable both for the environment and economically, right? And I think transportation has a big role. It's just such a big part of a number of our problems, but also opportunity for these different regions. And so I'm really happy to be back here to work on these problems that have interested me, since I went to college in the first place. So before I start the slides here, just my current role here at UVM is I'm an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, and also the director of the Transportation Research Center, a role I took on just last January. So most of my tenure as the director has been during the pandemic, and I only had the opportunity to be here at UVM a few months before the pandemic started. So that has made sort of getting out and meeting people and doing the networking and trying to do all those things you do when you move to a new place and get up and running a bit challenging, especially when you have small children also and are dragging them across country. So,
but we need those.
Yes.
Yeah. And they are very happy here. There's so much to do in Vermont. So it's been great. It's been a lot of work, but I think it's a great opportunity. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides. I'm happy to stop whenever and discuss any of these points, or we can, whatever best suits the committee. So let's see if we can do this here. And we'll start this. Okay. So let me on. So I'll start with just a little overview about the TRC. I'm going to talk about my vision for the Transportation Research Center moving forward, and then I am going to discuss how I think the TRC can support the state's transportation policy and planning needs. And I'm going to show an example or use climate change, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, as an example of some of the challenges and the opportunity we have with research, and particularly research focused on policy. So the Transportation Research Center was established in 2006 with a $16 million grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation, back in the day when they just handed out money and you didn't have to compete for it so much. And these days, it's a competitive process. As Emily discussed, there's this UTC program, and we compete and team up with other universities to take part in that. So this, but that grant established a TRC, but long before that, the UVM and the College of Engineering and Mathematical Sciences, which we call different things over time, has worked with VTrans and state on a number of projects for at least the last 40 years. So the TRC is located sort of physically within the institution in the College of Engineering and Mathematical Sciences. And, but we work with faculty. There are faculty involved in the center from across campus. And there are about 12 core faculty and research staff that are part of the center. So these are people that are generally working full-time. The staff work full-time on transportation, really research, and faculty that spend the majority of their time, in these areas. There's a number of other faculty that participate from time to time on projects, as needed. We also, being at the university, we don't offer any degrees in transportation per se, but we provide research opportunities for undergraduates, master's students, and PhD students. And so the research that is funded at UVM through the TRC goes to support undergraduate, master's, and PhD students. So with master's students, PhD students, we hire them as research assistants, where cover their tuition, pay them a stipend, and they work on the research. And I think a unique opportunity of funding research at your state university is that it also has this workforce development role. Students that work on projects for local state agencies are more likely to stay in the state and work in that profession afterwards, right? They start to understand the problems here. It's an opportunity to work with local partners and build those relationships. So the TRC also is home to, we have a number of other sort of centers and organizations underneath the TRC. So this includes the National Center for Sustainable Transportation, which Emily mentioned. And this is led by UC Davis and has partners, a few other partners. It's probably one of our largest sources of external research funding. The Transportation Infrastructure Durability Center is the regional center, the regional UTC with the University of Maine, focused on infrastructure. And we also run the Vermont Clean Cities Coalition with funding from the Department of Energy. And this is where we do outreach work on trying to help both industry, organizations, individuals, adopt more fuel efficient vehicles or alternative fuel vehicles and that type of thing. It's not a research focused center, it's outreach and sort of information sharing thing. And we also manage the Northeast Transportation Workforce Center, which is focused on training the transportation workforce, in this case, for the jobs and the skills that will need it to be a transportation, the transportation workforce of the future, right? It's going to be a lot more managing data and working on electric vehicles and things like that than in the past. And so it's a broad overview of the TRC. And so I arrived 2 years ago, and we decided to update the mission sort of goals of the center. And we came up with this new mission statement that our mission to serve as a hub for cutting edge multidisciplinary transportation research with a focus on sustainable and equitable solutions for smaller cities and rural communities in Vermont, New England, and elsewhere. And, Vermont, UVM is in a unique position nationally in that we are a leader in sustainability research. We're located in a relatively rural state and a small community, a relatively small city in Burlington. And, I think makes sense to align our Transportation Research Center with the natural advantage that the institution has, being a leader in this space. And and the mission has two parts. You know, we want to be a national leader on sustainable transportation research, focused on the unique and specific needs of smaller communities. And by smaller, I don't mean just small rural areas, but small cities like Burlington and rural areas that have not been the focus of most prior transportation research. A lot of what we know, especially in the policy and travel behavior fields, comes out of large urban areas, California, things like that. And some of that may translate to what we do here, can certainly inform the strategies we try to pursue, but not all of it does. And we have this dual purpose. We also want to be the comprehensive resource to meet the state's needs, whatever they are. Not necessarily, they may not be focused on sustainability or other things, but this is dealing with infrastructure, a number of things Emily was talking about, finding materials that can work as a sub-base and things like that. So we want to develop ourselves to be this national leader on research in this particular area that UVM has a real strength in. And then we also want to be a comprehensive resource for whatever the state's needs are, and those will evolve and change over time. And when we talk about sustainability, we're talking about the environment and the economy. And equity, as I think we all know, has become a important national issue. It has a number of dimensions. And when we're talking about equity here, we're talking about equity across socioeconomic groups, but also, between urban and rural communities. And this has become a increasingly important issue in transportation, because a lot of the new innovations, technologies, climate policies are going to affect urban households and businesses working in urban areas different than rural places, right? You can see that in, if you go to New York City before the pandemic, in half the vehicle traffic on the streets is an Uber and Lyft, but that's not what happens in Vermont, right? So how transportation technology affects how we travel is going to be a lot different in smaller and rural communities than in some more urban areas, and so we need to understand that. So that's what we're trying to do here. This is a partial list. There are numerous challenges, but as I see them, the big challenges coming up, biggest one is greenhouse gas emissions. How are we going to meet Act 153 greenhouse gas emission reduction targets? They are quite, those will be a challenge. It will be important to accelerate electric vehicle adoption to meet those targets, but as I'll highlight later, there are some significant challenges there as well. We'll need to also manage travel demand, or there's no way we'll meet those goals. Understanding the short and long-term impacts of COVID-19. We all know what COVID-19 has done to travel right now. We're all meeting virtually. I've never been to Montpelier. But what's the lasting impact of this? Are we going to learn to work from home? Is this just a big learning experience and we'll work from home a lot more than we used to? Will people shop a lot more remotely than they used to? And if that is true, then are the investments we're making in our transportation system necessary anymore? Do we rethink some of our projects that are adding capacity or addressing congestion and focus that more on infrastructure maintenance or some of our other goals and challenges? So it will be important to think about what this, COVID-19 hopefully will be behind us shortly, but the impact on travel behavior and where people choose to live and how they choose to work and go to school could be lasting. Maybe it won't be. It'll probably fall somewhere in between, right? But it'd be a big impact on travel and what types of investments and policies we might need to adopt. COVID-19, electric vehicles, we've sort of forgot, I think, about autonomous vehicles, but those are out there and they're coming right along as well. More slowly than anticipated a few years ago, but this is going to be something, it's not on the horizon, it's here, and we need to be prepared because this is something that could really, there are a lot of potential benefits and there are some significant challenges as well. How does this work in smaller rural communities? Really depends on, are people going to own autonomous vehicles? Is it a service you have to buy into? And then is that service provided in rural areas, just like the internet today? We've had high-speed internet for decades now, yet there are still parts of the state that have no reliable access to high-speed internet. Will become the same with transportation if transportation is run by technology companies, and it's really focused on making money in more urban and dense areas. So there are a number of other things to think about with autonomous vehicles. Just the usual, improving access to goods and services in small rural communities, doing medical care, education. We have aging population that is important to think about, and there are everything from micro transit ideas to thinking about land use and how to address these things, these challenges that have existed for a long time. And infrastructure maintenance and financing. It's everyone, I am sure, on this committee knows that there is a huge backlog of maintenance needs in the transportation with our transportation infrastructure. It's a national priority as well, and I think we're all expecting a big federal infrastructure bill. But we need to think about, and particularly with electric vehicles, how are we going to finance the transportation infrastructure?
That one you want to solve for us, please.
Yeah, so there's a number of things. There are a number of alternatives to doing this. There's trying to just create something equivalent with electricity. There's other things you can talk about. So those are the big things. I know there are a ton of other challenges out there. Probably there are some that I know of, and there's probably a bunch that I don't. But maybe we'll hear some more about that today. So those are the challenges. So what I want to talk about, I'm just going to pull out greenhouse gas mitigation as an example of some of our big challenges, and where better research directed at policy could play an important role in helping the state do this efficiently and effectively. So you've probably all seen some version of this type of plot before. This is overall greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. The little red X's are the new targets from Act 153, the Global Warming Solution Act. You might see the downward trend in that black line. It kind of lines up with the red X's, but it kind of looks like that line's just wiggling along above 1990 levels. 1990 levels, the dashed red line there, that's what we reference all our reductions to. So that's why I put that there. This is a big challenge. And transportation is a big part of the challenge. Transportation is the majority of the greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. And you can see that the share of greenhouse, the gray bar chunk in the middle has grown over time. And so the large share of greenhouse gas emissions from transportation is not just because other sectors have become more efficient. It's that it's grown over time. And you can also see that other sectors haven't really reduced much of their greenhouse gas emissions either. And this data only goes to 2016. It's from ANR's greenhouse gas inventory forecast. The more recent numbers are a bit more promising. There have been reductions. How do we compare to our neighbors? Well, we have one of the highest shares of greenhouse gas emissions from transportation of all the New England and Northeast states. It kind of depends, we're pretty close to New Jersey. And if we look at just the absolute change in greenhouse gas emissions from transportation since 1990, you can see that generally in most of the states, emissions have gone up, and now they're coming down with a few exceptions, like New Hampshire, for example, emissions are much higher. A lot of that's population growth there. But we have we're on the right trajectory if you look at it, where our emissions are decreasing, but they're still above what they were in 1990. If we look at this per capita, maybe another way to look at it, we have one of the highest amounts of greenhouse gas emissions per person from transportation in the Northeast. And it's among the highest in the country. And it's a rural state, it's not surprising. And you can see it's Maine and Vermont are those two top numbers. The other states have a declining trend where the trends are basically stable in the two most rural states in New England. And if we just
Yes, Senator Ingalls.
So when we have 660 cars and New York State's probably got 15 million, how would that even be possible that we emit more greenhouse gases per vehicle? And what's the correlation of us being rural? So that's to be expected. I just, I don't want to get into doubting all of that, how it got there, but what's the justification that we have more greenhouse gases when we have 660 cars or 660 people versus millions of others?
We don't have more greenhouse gas emissions, but per capita, per each person, we're producing more than the average person in New York. That's what this is looking at, right? And right in New York City, there's half households don't even own a car. People walk and use subway. In Vermont, that's not going to be the case, right? We have a lot more rural population. We drive more. There's more auto dependence. So per person, we have higher emissions. And because other states that are more urban have pursued bigger investments in transit, have done other strategies that don't necessarily translate to a more rural context like Vermont. And that's part of the point I want to make here is what works in New York City or in California isn't necessarily going to work in Vermont. It's different, right? We have totally different land use.
So,
Yes, Senator Kitchell.
but it's very interesting to look at the Vermont experience. I don't know what it'd be about 2012 and up. Have you done some analysis in terms of what would have made the difference in that period of time? I see in 2005, we kind of peaked. We're not back to 2005. We're measuring ourselves against, I guess, 2012. So you have in looking at this, obviously our rural nature didn't change much in that period of time. What have been other factors that would have influenced the line on the graph as we're seeing it?
Yeah, we had a huge, financial crisis in this country in around 2010, right? Gas prices shot up to over $3 a gallon, huge amount of unemployment. So, that
2008 was the beginning of the recession. So it kind of peaked, or kind of the trough was 2012. So you think that it was driven by the
there
price
are
of
a
gas?
number.
Price
Yeah,
of gas is a big influence. There's no question. People will use public transit if it becomes, convenience versus cost is a big factor there. But I was just wondering if you had taken a look at what those factors might be.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer because there's a lot of factors. But one of the biggest factors in these lines are population and employment, and the overall economy. So, and the recession was in 2008, 2009, but the recovery has taken some time. And there are certainly could be other factors. There's also just differences year to year in how these numbers are even accounted for, and they're all estimates.
Senator Kidden.
Yeah, so Dr. Roengeld, it's nice to have you here today. Really exciting work. Picking up on that same thread, you laid it a lot on the rurality, if that's a word, how rural Vermont is. But I'd be really curious in your studies so far, are there other factors like do Vermonters have older stock vehicles? Are we not keeping up with newer cars? All-wheel drive, we have, since we're so rural and we are a mountainous state, Do all-wheel drive vehicles have lower fuel standards? Pickup truck percentage. I heard from Tim Ash at one point that Vermonters love their pickup trucks more so than the other states. I'd love to know if that's a factor. And then the last thing that I heard Senator Kitchell say that would be very great interest to me is access. Not only whether or not people want to take the bus to public transit. Do we have enough public transit to really reduce these carbon emissions? So could you speak about more than just the rurality of Vermont that might be contributing to our higher per capita?
Yeah, so we're going to get there. I'm trying to set the stage a little here. And I've got some figures on our vehicle fleet and our transit use over time and those type of things, statistics. No, you're right, there's a lot here. There are our preferences for vehicles, there's the use of other modes, there's, it's a very complex, this is sort of the outcome we're interested in. There are many factors that go into driving these trends. And that, of course, is what we want to understand. We want to understand this so we can create policies that drive these trends in the right direction and do it in a manner that's cost effective and equitable for population living in different communities in Vermont. So this is just isolating our transportation emissions. You can see they only basically increased over time. So factors over here. Well, despite the various policies that have been adopted, investments, the percent of trips being made alone in a car have grown year over year since 2009, which is the statistics that are readily available from the Vermont Transportation Energy Profile. The amount of carpooling has declined. The amount of walking has declined. Public transit has increased a tiny amount. It's relatively insignificant. And, bicycling and other modes are basically stable and really don't account for much. Right? Almost all trips are made by driving. And most of those are driving by yourself in a car, and that has only increased. Additionally, Vermonters are driving more and more each year and drive on average much further per year than people in the rest of the country.
Yes, Senator Perchlik.
Yeah, thank you. You get this data direct from AOT, or do you get it from another source?
This data is from the Vermont Transportation Energy Profile, which is from AOT, but the Transportation Research Center actually writes this report for AOT. And the data comes from, federal highways, US DOT, there's a big process. It actually ends up in that state DOTs usually collect this data, report it to the federal agencies, who then, compile it, and then we look at it and put together this report.
Is that why there's like a 4-year delay on the data?
Yeah, it takes, there's a big delay. So we are only funded by VTrans to write this report every 2 years. So we're right now creating a 2021 version. And then that will, we don't have 2021 data because it's still 2021. And the latest federal highway statistics are from 2019. So there is a delay.
So you write the report every 2 years, but your graph here has every year data. So you have the data for every year, but you just publish it every 2 years. Yeah,
and we won't. So like this year, we'll publish this by the end towards fall 2021. It will have probably data through 2019. So there's about a year delay before the government checks all the data and publishes it.
I wonder how do they get all these statistics? How do they know who drives alone or who's got a bicycle or walking? It's got to be. I just question those how they can get that kind of information, because boy, it seems like it's, I don't know, it's very, very different.
And seeing how much we spend on bike pass and all of that stuff,
I know.
Maybe we ought to stop it. Maybe we ought to stop it because it's not doing anything. We have walking pass and bike pass and all of that. And maybe we got to rethink our strategy and not fund it so much.
Something wrong, because like Burlington, bike stations all over the place. You can go out to the mall, rent a bike. You can go anywhere you want.
One of the things we talked about, and they do it in Europe, and if people are commuting into urban areas or into cities, they're closing down certain roads to make. We talked about that relative to Montpelier, and it would. It's a policy that influences behavior. So there are ways that it can be done, just like just like some of the things that we've seen done in other cities. But we did talk about it a little bit last year in terms of how you can change behavior and influence the take up of public transit.
But I look at the data that we have here starting from 2009 to 2017, and it's going in the opposite direction with all the money that's been spent and all the public awareness that's been spent and everything that's been spent, and it hasn't changed a bit. I find it hard to follow.
So there are two things here to realize. One is goes to Senator Mazza's comment is believing the data. The data are sample and estimate. And these are generated by the U.S. Census Bureau. It's from the American Community Survey, which is a continuous rolling survey. So every day they're sending out they're surveying Americans across all communities. And, it's a relatively small sample. And they ask a question about how you commute to work. So first of all, this is only for trips commuting to work, which are a significant share of trips. And in places with smaller populations, there is more uncertainty in these estimates, right? Because, there's not a ton of transit and bicycle use in Vermont as a whole. And so these numbers could be plus or minus, a few percent. But you can clearly see the trends, that these trends are stable and not quite going in the direction I think we want. And that is exactly the point I'm trying to make here, is that Vermont has adopted a number of strategies that have worked in other places, that have potential. We can certainly increase the amount of bicycling. We can certainly increase the amount of transit, carpooling. We can do all these things, but we need to understand how they work in Vermont. And we need to collect the data to know when things are working and when they're not, so that we're making smart investments. And I would argue that's not necessarily what we've been doing in the past. I think the policy, the strategies that have been adopted are good. They're a good starting place. They're the right general approach. But these things need to be tailored to Vermont. And
what data on this sheet would show you that, though? What data here would show you that of all the millions that we spent, that we're headed in the right direction? Because there's no change in the data.
We're not. That's the point. We need to inform our policies and strategies. We need this is the research we need to do, right? We don't have a ton of great data either on how people travel in Vermont. We're relying on the U.S. Census Bureau to do a small sample of just commuting to work.
The other thing I would say is anyone who gets a phone call of any of these questions, if they're doing it by phone, would not answer them anyway, because people are not answering questions anymore on phone calls, or I don't know if they're answering questions any other way, because we're so many robocalls these days. So I don't know do they get this by phone calls, or
they use multiple methods, but they have a rigorous process to check the representativeness of the sample. So they know when they're not getting certain communities, and those are weighted. And
but I think one of the things that we still hear, and I just see that the same forces at work, and that is human behavior. I cannot believe when you go into Boston, the number of people who are single occupancy vehicles sitting there in backed up traffic when there is the HOV lane. It is very hard, just like with any behavior change, carpooling. Some people, they don't want to carpool because of the what they perceive as the inconvenience. I've heard that a lot. On the other hand, I've carpooled since 1972, and I know it can work. So it's some of what we're dealing here as it relates to transportation patterns. and how people will change their driving relative to carpooling or walking or public transit. It really does tie into the challenge of how you change how, if you have a choice, how people, and some people may not have a choice depending on their nature of their work or whatever, but to change those behaviors. And it is tough. Whatever, it doesn't matter what we're talking about, whether it's exercise, nutrition, etc. It's that human dimension is always a challenge.
Mhm. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, getting people to carpool, even in places where you would seemingly be much easier, like big city like Boston or California, New York, is still very challenging. And it's only a larger challenge here. That said, I mean, a lot of people use the park and ride lots and the GMT buses that bring people into Burlington and stuff are well used. It's just, it's still only a small share of the overall amount of travel. So there are big challenges with travel behavior with, right, most people traveling single occupancy vehicles. So if we wanted to deal with greenhouse gas emissions, I mean, this is the focus on electric vehicles because it's going to be hard to change travel behavior. It's necessary. It's absolutely necessary to reduce the amount that we're driving per capita, and there are opportunities to do that. Some of those will take time. Electric vehicles are generally seen as a path to quicker decarbonization, right? Because you don't have to address some of these more challenging issues around travel and the amount of travel we do. So in electric vehicles, so I've got the three-legged stool here. It's a metaphor we use a lot in transportation. If we want to reduce emissions, right, there are three components: the amount that we travel, how energy efficient that travel is, and then the emission intensity of the fuel or energy source using that travel. Electric vehicles address two of those. An electric motor is more efficient than an internal combustion engine, and the fuel source, it depends on where we get our electricity, but in Vermont, it's very low carbon. So electric vehicles are attractive. However, our goal, EV registration goal of 50,000 EVs on the road in Vermont by 2025, which is what the Comprehensive Energy Plan and the governor have stated as a goal and what we need to do to be on track to meet our greenhouse gas mitigation targets. You can see where that red dot's far away. I mean, it's not far away in time, but it's much higher than where we're at. And the blue line below are current electric vehicle registrations. Only about, roughly a third, a little more than a third of those are fully electric vehicles, right? These are just the battery electric vehicles. Majority of our electric vehicles are plug-in hybrids, so they could be used as a gasoline-powered vehicle or electric. So this is a challenge too. So travel behavior change is a challenge, but getting more electric vehicles on the road quickly enough to meet our goals is also going to be a significant challenge. One of the strategies deployed in Vermont and a number of our neighbors is to offer rebates for the purchase of these vehicles. Vermont has very generous rebates and has a unique setup with the new electric vehicle rebate program that limits, that tries to target the rebates to low and moderate income households. And you can see that the structure of the rebates is different in the different states. So many states don't have any limitations on who can get the rebate. Some states have no limitations on the price of the vehicle or your income on the vehicles. Some states, such as New Jersey, New York, tie the amount of the rebate to the all-electric range of the vehicle. Maine has also included a rebate for used electric vehicles for low-income households. So there's a wide range of rebates being deployed. And if you look over to the chart on the right, you can see Vermont has actually achieved one of the highest per capita electric vehicle penetration rates in the Northeast. You can also see that California is far ahead of everyone else. In fact, Washington, Oregon, California have far more electric vehicles as a share of total vehicle registrations than any other state. And California has numerous incentives for electric vehicles that go beyond these rebates. You can use the HOV lanes. You can have extensive electric vehicle charging infrastructure and other things.
What's New York have? New York have?
New York has right. New York is down here. It's
Down here,
a little
okay.
less than Vermont.
Yeah.
And you can see, so Maine's really low, but Maine has just introduced all these new rebate programs. So I expect that to probably increase. And it looks like rebates work. I mean, rebates are and you can look at a national picture. There's a number of states that have no rebates and essentially no electric vehicles.
Senator Perchley.
On the slide before,
yeah,
where it lists it's only 38% battery electric vehicles. I mean, of that total that we have, whatever we have, like almost 4,000, 38% of those are battery electric. The other are plug-in hybrids.
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to confirm that.
Yeah, and so I don't know in the state's comprehensive energy plan if they're imagining, when they've looked at the greenhouse gas emission reductions they expect to get, if they're imagining those as all battery electrics or plug-in. But obviously the greenhouse gas emissions would be different depending on what those are. So the point here, there's a lot of different rebate programs going on. It's unclear how effective they are, what the right numbers should be, but it does seem, the evidence emerging is that this does help. It certainly seems to work. It's better than nothing. Rural equity with electric vehicles is a challenge. You can see that most of the electric vehicle registrations are in Chittenden County, and this is per capita, so it's not just because more people live in Chittenden County. And they're not as attractive in more rural areas. And Vermont, Maine, I'm sure we have lots of rural areas.
Yes, Senator Chittenden.
So I'm going to ask a relatively naive question, and I want to preface it by saying I'm always going to advocate for those Vermonters that are the least well off, especially on the socioeconomic spectrum. But on your previous slide, I have to ask if there is a rational reason to not necessarily target electric incentives to benefit those on the lowest income, but instead to benefit those that are using or on the roads most enough, like electrifying fleets of vehicles that are putting a great deal of mileage and CO2 emissions into the state. And then coupling that, I'm a big proponent of public transportation. I think we need to expand public transportation so that we get people out of those single occupancy vehicles. But does the framing of that question make any sense, that maybe it's not the best thing to do to have the lowest income individuals have access to the electrification, but the highest users or emitters of CO2 to motivate them to electrify their fleet?
Yeah, no, you bring up, this is an important policy question. What's the goal here, is if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we want to replace the most inefficient vehicles that are driven the most as quickly as possible. And those may not necessarily be vehicles driven by the lowest income households or vehicles driven by people in Chittenden County, for that matter. And so that is one aspect of it. The other is, to the extent that the federal government or the state of Vermont enacts additional climate policies that increase the cost of travel. Say if there's a carbon tax or some, I don't know what's ahead with federal policy, or if we were to join the TCI effort or something like that. Well, that would potentially increase the cost of driving a conventional vehicle. And to the extent that lower income households, are less have difficulty switching to more fuel efficient vehicles, electric vehicles, that could represent inequity that I think we would want to address as well. So I think there's a balance, and there are ways to structure programs and policies to address these things. Everything from, we're talking about these rebates. There's been proposals for a rebate in Vermont. There are all sorts of policy tools that can address various aspects of program effectiveness, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and equity issues. And this is getting to the, your earlier comment about what Vermonters are driving. It's trucks, mostly Ford F-150s. It's the #1 selling vehicle in the country, and you know, super popular here. And you know, you can look on the left. These are the electric vehicles that are registered in Vermont, and you know, they just don't match what most people actually drive. And Vermont can't directly do anything about this right now. We don't, you know, these are the cars that are on the market. And this is why it's going to be a big challenge to meet our targets, unless, I mean, we have a supply side issue. Unless the vehicle manufacturers produce electric vehicles of the type that most people drive, there's only so far we can go with rebates and building out charging networks and that sort of thing, right? We need vehicles that match the preferences of people. And maybe consumers need to meet somewhere in between, but this is a huge challenge. And this is the rationale behind, for example, the internal combustion phase out policies in Europe and in California, is to push vehicle manufacturers to produce, you know, a wider range of electric vehicles, and because that's the #1 thing.
What's the total registration of Vermont vehicles? 600,000 or?
I don't know that number off the top
Just
of my head,
curious.
but yeah, there's typically a few more vehicles than there are people.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, particularly our chair.
Oh, yeah, I knew that was coming. I keep the motor vehicle financial well off. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Wow. So there's
There's-
40,000 Ford trucks registered. Wow.
Are you going to compare that to other states? How we proportionally compare in truck purchases?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have that sort of disaggregate data, but I believe this is a trend that's national. I mean, big trucks and SUVs are popular everywhere, even in urban areas. But in rural states, yeah, there are a lot more pickup trucks and large SUVs than elsewhere. And of course, if you look at our cars too, the most popular models are all-wheel drive vehicles, and there are, you know, you can't. There's no substitute. There's no equivalent electric vehicle for that right now.
Chair Mazza?
Yes.
So
Right.
I don't know how we go about getting our hands on that data more, but it seems worth exploring. I understand, I don't live in as rural of an area as Senator Ingalls and others, but I will say you need a pickup truck when you live out in the country because you got to move stuff. And so it would be useful for me to know how that compares. So as we start to craft policy at a state level, I think of things like trash collection. I hear that Vermont is somewhat out of step when it comes to municipal trash collection. And if that might translate to a decreased need for pickup trucks when you got to haul your trash to the dump every week, if there was more municipally provided managed services, that would also be more eco-efficient. So I'm intrigued to understand how to not stop people from buying pickup trucks, but maybe to address that demand for them through statewide policies or incentives to decrease.
It's the second automobile of the car. They look on them as an automobile these days versus a pickup truck because they're so plush and they're so everything you want. People are buying them in replacement of a vehicle, of a car. I don't think they're using them as much as we think they're using them. I think they're just using them for a pleasure car, just like SUVs. When's the last time you seen a sedan out there? I took a count the other day on my way home from somewhere. I counted 31 SUVs and 2 sedans. So the whole market has gone SUVs.
Yeah.
A few years ago, that was unheard of. But today,
It's about 70% of the new car market.
is that right? Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
And there are electric SUVs. I mean, they're just coming in,
Yeah.
but
Right. Yeah.
Model Y from Tesla and then the Ford Mustang, which is just coming out now, are both what I would call 4-wheel drive SUVs or crossovers.
So I own a car wash that could do larger SUVs and pickup trucks, and I expanded that so that I could accommodate those, and I've doubled my business so that I can do, it doubled my business.
Wow. So you had to make it bigger for the bigger vehicles, right?
Yep, I didn't have enough room in there, and I didn't have enough for the washer, the touchless washer, to get around them. It just wasn't designed for it. So I extended the building 8 feet and put a brand new washing system in, and it doubled my business.
Wow, amazing, changing. Wow.
Can you charge the electric car as you're going through the wash?
You can. That guy gets wet because he's out there cranking the crank. But
Wait a minute. Now you're talking about Senator Kitchell's car here. Don't go there, okay?
Well, her hair gets a little damp, but that's okay.
Well, I heard you on Wednesday talking about wanting to get a level 2 charger up there. I think
Yes.
maybe get a DC fast charger in that car wash.
Well, I have room for that, and I would and that's my frustrations, as you probably heard the other day.
Do you have 3-phase power?
I do.
Yeah. So, yeah, you could be a full service. And do you serve coffee and donuts too?
I will.
You stay out of the grocery business, okay? Come on. Now you're treading on the grocery business.
Well, I'm going to have the biggest pie business in all of the states.
No, I saved that for Chittenden. He's a pie man. Okay.
All right. So I wanted to raise that there are challenges, difficulties, and problems. It seems like that point has gotten across. So the last thing here, so this is where it comes into how can I help you, and I being the Transportation Research Center and UVM, make progress here. So the last thing I point out before I move into that is that this is not a challenge just in Vermont, this is across the country. And as I see it, moving from having worked in California, in Los Angeles, in Albuquerque, and now here, and this is from the National Academies of Science on a report they did looking at how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, how to support policy making, decision making, is that almost all the research is from an urban area. And there's been virtually no attention given to rural areas and smaller places. And so we're here with, I can't answer all your questions. I don't have the data to answer all these questions. These come through research. And states like California, in major urban areas, have collected tons of data, have built huge research centers to deal with congestion mostly, and then air quality problems from traditional air pollutants related to that, and now greenhouse gas emissions. And they're in a good position to look at these policies, study them, because they've built capacity, data, systems of collecting data, research capacity, a workforce that can work on these problems over decades. And congestion, air quality concerns, not a major challenge in more rural places. Rural and smaller states, the big challenge has been maintaining infrastructure, traffic safety concerns, and things like that. But now with greenhouse gas emissions, this is something that is just as relevant here in Vermont as it is in California. So we are in kind of a difficult spot compared to some of our more urban neighbors, and there is this real research gap. And I wanted to highlight, and I mentioned this before, that Vermont has adopted a whole number of plans, strategies. There's been a number of policies. We've been early on the scene in adopting aggressive greenhouse gas emission targets, and these are really commendable things. And Vermont's really a leader. But it hasn't been moving the needle, right, as we've seen, as much as I think we hope or need to. And so and this is a very simplified representation of how I see policy around transportation policy addressing greenhouse gas emissions as it currently stands. Is we've adopted goals, identify potential mitigation strategies, largely looking to other states and innovative things that have kind of worked in other places. The costs are evaluated, but usually qualitatively. If you go back and look at a number of these studies, you'll see that most of the strategies are talked about how well they've worked in other places. Generally, the logic behind the policy, and qualitatively, how it would work. But because we lack some of the basic data about how people in Vermont travel and would respond to policies, it's hard to create a quantitative forecast and get a more detailed look. And then we implement strategies. And so when I think about a policy, a transportation policy or strategy, and in this example, looking at greenhouse gas emissions, we're thinking about three things: effectiveness. I mean, how many tons of greenhouse gas emissions will this reduce? Does it put us on a path to meeting our targets? Next thing is efficiency. How much does this cost? What is the dollar per ton reduced, right? Is investing in, for the purpose of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, is investing in a bicycle path, as efficient as investing in transit, as efficient as subsidizing electric vehicles, right? We want to know those questions too. And then there's equity. I mean, how are these costs distributed across Vermonters, both socioeconomically speaking, and also the different regions, different communities, urban, rural. And there are, when equity isn't just the cost of the program or the potential negative impact of some policy, but also the good, the outcomes, right? Who's benefiting to it. And so those are the three things, right? We think about when we adopt a policy or strategy, and we have limitations. We don't have Vermont travel behavior data. We don't have really any information on how people respond to prices, whether it be a carbon tax or a subsidy. We don't really know a lot about the factors driving the vehicles people purchase. We know they like pickup trucks, and we know people in Burlington drive a lot of Subarus, but we don't know much about what other factors are driving decisions, and are there some that we could influence? Mode and housing location choice are important to understand. Where people choose to live affects how much they drive. And are people, do they have the opportunity to live where they want to live? Would people choose to live in different locations if opportunities were there, and if they understood the costs or the implications of travel, etc. We don't have a lot of models. We don't have a lot of sophisticated policy analysis models, forecasting models, those tools to look at the economic impacts of our policies around transportation, both their effectiveness and their efficiency. And so these are some of our limitations. And where I see the role of research and TRC, UVM, is creating something a bit more circular here, where we start with, we have our goals, we identify our strategies as we've done, and then we create models that allow us to do some quantitative analysis and forecasting, right? What is the efficiency of this? What is the dollar per ton reduced? How effective? How many tons of greenhouse gas emissions will we get by investing in public transit or this EV subsidy or a number of other programs that we could think about? We then we ideally look at, we use these tools to think about the mitigation potential, the efficiency, the equity input outcomes. We're gonna have to create bundles of strategies. There's not just gonna be one strategy, obviously, that's gonna get us to our goals. So we can develop some pathways. We probably want to develop multiple pathways because one may not work. There's a lot of uncertainties in these things. And then we implement them. And this is where I call this a data-driven process of feedback and learning. We're gonna implement stuff. We're not gonna have the best models. We're not gonna have the best data yet. As we implement things, we can learn from what's working. We can learn what works, what does not work, but we need an actual strategy in place to collect data in a way that we can estimate the effectiveness, the efficiency, and equity outcomes of the strategies we're adopting now. And then that can be fed back in to think about how to adjust strategies. Do we need new strategies? And on the research side, over here on the TRC, we can take this data, update our models, improve our ability to forecast, improve our ability to evaluate different strategies, so that as we move forward with looking at things in the future, where we have more accurate models, we have a better ability to answer your questions. I have the data to ask to hopefully answer why the lines are moving in certain directions and those type of things. And so we obviously don't have the time to collect a ton of data, do a bunch of research to implement the perfect policy. But we can certainly think about how, as we adopt things and do things, how we can make sure we're collecting data and informing future decisions, tracking how things are working now, and hopefully meet our goals. And this is an example as greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, but you can think about the same thing for a number of the things that we care about.
Senator Chittenden, do you have a question or?
Well, you know, I don't want to steal your thunder from your next slide. I did peek ahead, Dr. Rowengold, but I wanted to say three things. I'm just really interested to know how going forward. I'm new in this role. I'm the new guy, as I keep liking to say, and in this senatorial role. And I'd be interested to know how to educate myself on something you said earlier on. You mentioned that you don't know how COVID might affect transportation demand, and then you raised the question, do we need less transportation infrastructure? The question I want to ask is autonomous vehicles. And I'm concerned that autonomous vehicles are actually going to exacerbate our roadways and are going to demand a lot more of them. I'm familiar with Javon's paradox and how you make something more efficient. People are going to use it a lot more. So I have that same question that I want to educate myself on as autonomous vehicles come online. And I don't know how to engage through the state and through these roles with the Transportation Research Center. I knew Dr. Lisa Altman Hall, but she left. So I was going to have the conversations with her. So I guess now maybe I should buy you a cup of coffee sometime and figure out how I can expand on these ideas.
Yeah, well, the autonomous vehicle thing that's a good question. I've actually have a research project funded by US EPA and the New Mexico Department of Transportation, where we created a model to look at how autonomous vehicles could affect travel demand and where people and businesses locate. And as you would expect, autonomous vehicles will increase travel demand, increase the amount of sprawl, though it really depends on the type of city. So if you don't have congestion, autonomous vehicles, there's so many dynamics. So autonomous vehicles can make better use of our existing roadway capacity, right? You can get twice as much vehicle, traffic flow on our existing roads with autonomous vehicles in ideal world. That may not be reality. And but on the flip side is making travel that much more convenient. I tell the students in my classes, imagine what you can do with a fully autonomous vehicle, right? You could, you could just live in your car. You had a photovoltaic cell on top of a camper van and you could just drive around the roads rent-free. You could have a happy hour with your friends on the way to the ski area after school because you don't have to drive the car. People could just, super commuting could be a thing. There's a number of pros and cons, and we can develop the models to look at some of this. We did this in New Mexico, but it requires it takes a sustained effort to have the basic building blocks of those models and forecasting tools, and then we have to collect actual data on the behaviors of Vermonters.
I don't want to interrupt, but we've got about 5 minutes left because we have to be on the floor at 11:30. So I just want to give everybody a couple minutes. So if we could wrap it up in 5 minutes, we could.
Yeah. So I just have here's a list of, and again, you have a copy of these slides, so you can look there. But if I could send my wish list to your committee, to VTrans, whoever, this is the research I see that we need. We need to build more capacity to understand how people choose their vehicles and forecast these vehicle markets, whether it's EVs, but also just higher efficiency vehicles. We need to be able to estimate travel demand, how it responds to prices, fuel consumption. If we want to look at alternatives to the gas tax, we're going to have to understand. We have to be able to forecast travel, to forecast that revenue. We have to understand how, as we raise taxes or fees to collect that, what does that do to demand? We want to look at transit. So we're making substantial investments in transit. How can we make them work better? How can we understand if they are working, who they're working for, where are the weak points there? There's just a lot there's a lot to do. And I'm hopeful that, I'm out looking for federal funds every day to do some of this, and we have some success there, but a lot of these things specific to Vermont are things that the federal agency or the National Science Foundation are not really going to support, right? These are things that fall on us to, if these are our priorities, we need to make these investments. And hopefully they're, I think will lead to more efficient policy, more effective policies. And so I'll just leave you with, this is ultimately what I think about, and what is, just what does sustainable transportation system look like in Vermont? It's not going to be what it looks like in California. And
I think I see Senator Ingalls up there in the corner. They're driving along. I think it's
Yeah, that's me. Riding my bicycle.
that's a nice shot.
so
I can see my house. I can see my house from there, though.
There you go.
Yeah.
So that's what I've got. And
Thank you. A very good presentation. A lot of information there to get a hold of. So any other questions before he leaves?
No.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us this morning. And if you want to return sometime, give us a shout.
All right. Well, I'm happy to
Thank you.
join you some other time. And when the circumstances are right, I'd love to come down to Montpelier sometime. Never been.
Good. That's a good place to come. Thank you.
All right. Have a good week.
Okay.